that shocked even the Wehrmacht. The Red Army's offensive tactics reflected the value it placed on the lives of infantrymen. Major attacks were often launched not with elite guards armies, but by shock armies of infantry who would be thrown at the defences in vast numbers to create gaps which the elite units would then exploit. Often, the shock armies were themselves spearheaded by penal battalions, units made up of men who had committed military or civil crimes. Their missions were usually suicidal and could involve clearing minefields by marching across them in formation at gunpoint. By the end of 1944, the German army was a shadow of the awesome machine that 5 years earlier had unleashed blitzkrieg on an unsuspecting world. In the east, it could still field more than 3 million men, but appalling losses had severely reduced the quality of its fighting formations. At Hitler's insistence, under-strength divisions that should have been merged were retained as independent entities, carrying a heavy burden of administration and logistical support. German industry, in spite of increasing its output of war material to the highest level ever, was failing to keep up with the enemy's production, or with German losses, particularly in tanks and aircraft. A panzer division now had a theoretical strength of only 120 tanks, little more than a third of its 1939 complement. In reality, many had less than 60, and the German army was increasingly relying on cheaper, less effective, self-propelled guns. In the air, the Luftwaffe, exhausted from its desperate attempts to stem the tide of Allied air power, had already passed the point of no return. Aircraft production had reached the amazing figure of 40,000 in 1944, but even such a feat could not redress the balance. The Luftwaffe could still field fewer combat aircraft than it could in 1940. And to compound its difficulties, there was also a major fuel crisis. Allied bombers had systematically hammered the German oil industry, and in the coming months, fuel would become the constant preoccupation of every German commander of air or ground forces. By late 1944, the Mark V Panther made up around half the strength of German armoured divisions on the Eastern Front. The best medium tank deployed by any army in World War II, the Panther G incorporated many modifications suggested by tank crews in the field. In particular, the Panther's side armour had been increased in thickness, and the reliability of the tank's drivetrain had been greatly improved. Like earlier models, the Panther G was armed with a supremely well-designed, long-barreled 75mm gun, capable of penetrating 120mm of sloped armour at over 1,000 yards. The Panther could carry a massive ammunition load of 81 rounds. In January 1943, a new Tiger was ordered which would have a turret large enough to mount a longer, more powerful 88mm gun than its predecessor. The King Tiger's hull design was similar to the Panther, well sloped for greater protection, while frontal armour was increased to an unprecedented 150mm. The King Tiger weighed 70 tons and was the heaviest tank to serve in World War II. Delivered to frontline units in June 1944, the new tanks quickly showed they could easily destroy any opponent. In all, 489 King Tigers were built. The Nebelwerfer, or smoke thrower, as it was called for security reasons, had been developed by German scientists long before the war. Although rocket detachments were in service with the German army from 1934, the weapons did not see action until the invasion of the Soviet Union. There, the Nebelwerfer quickly showed itself to be an effective area bombardment weapon, with a powerful demoralizing effect on enemy troops. The Nebelwerfer launcher was a simple design of 5 or 6 tubes mounted on a light trailer. The rockets were fired by electrical impulses, and a whole battery could be launched simultaneously. The first launchers fired 15cm projectiles, but later a more destructive 21cm version was produced in significant numbers. The Goliath was an expendable remote-controlled demolition weapon designed to attack bunkers, buildings, or even tanks with a high explosive charge. The first production model was battery-powered. Later versions were powered by a motorcycle engine and carried a heavier charge over a greater distance. The Goliath was connected to its operator by a 650-meter-long 3-strand wire rolled on a drum at the back of the chassis. 2 strands controlled track speed and steered the vehicle, while the other detonated the charge. In combat, the Goliath was maneuvered up to the side of the obstacle to be destroyed and triggered from a safe distance. Although the Goliath was used extensively on the Eastern Front and was moderately successful, particularly in built-up areas, it was extremely vulnerable to small arms fire. The Panzerfaust was a single-shot, throwaway anti-tank weapon. First produced in the summer of 1943, the device was a 120mm hollow-charge stick bomb fitted into a tube which contained the propellant. The Panzerfaust had a crude sight and trigger arrangement, but at distances of up to 150 meters, it could penetrate the side or rear armor of any existing tank and most frontal armor under the right conditions. Because of its cheapness, ease of use and light weight, anyone could be trained to use the Panzerfaust. In the Battle of Berlin, Home Guard and Hitler Youth would use the weapon to take a heavy toll of Soviet tanks. Germany's second infantry anti-tank rocket was the Panzer Schreck, introduced in August 1944. A copy of the American bazooka, the weapon fired an 88mm shaped charge projectile. The launching tube was reusable